Hello, welcome to the second episode of The Building Revolution, brought to you by the Smart Building Collective and Edge Next. We're really excited to be here with you all. We have some amazing guests. We're going to let you introduce yourselves. I'm Nicholas White, co-founder of the Smart Building Collective. We're really working hard to move the industry, bring partners together, bring knowledge, insight, and a lot of amazing topics to discuss. Today, we're going to be talking about the stakeholder map. As we digitize real estate and as real estate is changing, the stakeholder map is, it's fragmented. It's kind of all over the place in different spaces. So how do we bring them together? How do we align them? And we really want to see this from a bird's eye view first, from a high perspective, and then we'll drill down and see how it can impact your business. You're doing Splinter?
Here with Splitter, yes. So I work for Tata Consultancy Services, and I am the lead for one of the consulting practices in Europe. So happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
I'm Peter Krijns. I am the director for Métier Viva in the Benelux, and Métier Viva is a smart data solution for all office real estate or all real estate. But that's it's
Nice to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and Jonathan Whistler, CEO of Edge Next, and we're broadcasting from Edge Next Studio. So welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here. And yeah, Edge Next, if you're not familiar with us, we are an intelligent building platform. So we aggregate data from the building to provide actionable insights that make it better for people that are using the building and plan it by reducing the carbon emissions.
Yeah, we really want to bring different stakeholders together. And, Jeroen doesn't even come from the real estate space. He comes from more industry transformation, customer success, looking at it from a little bit of a different perspective. Peter, the reason we have brought him is he's always had his finger on the next technology, the innovations that are happening in the space. And then actually, Jonathan, your history is quite interesting, coming from the transformation of cloud computing and that whole industry. So let's kick it off. I think the first question I would pose maybe to you, Jeroen, is what are the things that we should be looking at within an industry when it comes to change, when it's transforming? How do we know that we're transforming, and how do we know that it's being kind of disrupted?
Well, obviously, different industries, different trends, different backgrounds, different everything. But I think overall, when I discuss with clients transformation and disruption, also one of those words that you hear all the time, there's usually about three elements that you look at. So there's the business viability, so our business models being changed, right? Or technological innovation, right? It pure comes from technology, but it can also come from humans. Human needs are changing. We all went through the COVID crisis, and human needs and behaviors change as well. So disruption can come from different angles then, right? So when I meet with clients and when we discuss disruption in their particular industry, then quite often for me, it's important to understand where's the disruption coming from to start with, right? So for example, back in the days already, I'm saying back in the days as if it's like in the 19th century, but when Uber came around, right? Completely different business model, right? Or where Airbnb came around, completely different business model. So that clearly, of course, technology enables, but the overriding principle behind it was a different business model. But then also you have COVID-driven interactions where, for example, I work now with a global life science company where the question is, okay, so how can my sales force remotely sell, right? And you can see technologies enabling that remote and hybrid way of working. That's, again, you could say, well, that's technology that drives that. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's technology driving it. It's different human behaviors driving it. And that's the one thing that sometimes when you read magazines and when you read newspapers or you see interviews, everybody's just, consumed by technology. And for all the right reasons. I'm not saying that that's wrong. But at the end of the day, technology is always an enabler of something, an enabler of a particular model, business model, particular or enabler of a particular behavior. And so the disruption that I look for is, in a sense, less driven by technology, but more driven by new business models and how they impact an overall ecosystem and an industry.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I've been doing disruption for a long time. And I actually struggle with the word disruption because in the end, you're not building technology for technology's sake. You're building it to accommodate a different user need or a different business model. And I've been in situations that are very successful and ones that are not successful. And if you're driving technology for technology's sakes or for disruption's sake and not meeting a user need or satisfying or changing the business model dynamics, it's not successful.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it needs to begin is, okay, what's the demand? What is the human need or the business need? And then find the right technology, not the other way around.
And then there's another element, if you don't mind me saying, there's also business viability, right? Even if you're a first mover in the market, unless you're in a non-profit industry, you're still doing it to end up with a footprint that you can increase, but also with increased revenue of some sort, right? So even as a first mover in any industry, I would imagine also real estate, there is still at one stage a question, where does the business viability come from? And that's KPI driven, right? Is it footprint that you're increasing? Is it customer experience? KPIs around NPS, for example, is that improving it? Or there needs to be a KPI at one stage, bottom line, top line, right? That improves that, and that's also a disruption.
So as we are digitizing real estate now and taking what you just said, how are we doing? Do we have new business models emerging? Do we have those KPIs already defined?
I don't know if they are defined already, but if you look at the usage of a building, and for instance, take the building here, it's used to its full potential, that it's not only used on Tuesdays and Thursdays, for instance. So that you don't need a lot of buildings to facilitate the people that are working there, because a lot of time buildings will be empty or partially filled.
So we can improve the efficiency and the optimization.
Yeah.
What do you think? How are we doing?
Yeah, I think we're early days in terms of really defining those KPIs. I think in a lot of cases you have some very simple ones, and like what Medio Viva is doing, they could come in and have a clear ROI on energy savings. So I think that's a really important one, especially these days with energy prices. But when I look at it, and also in my background in cloud computing, it wasn't driving costs to zero. It was really about asset utilization. And to Pedro's point, right, how do you utilize your asset more, because then ultimately it's more profitable, not necessarily just drive the cost down to zero. So I think in real estate, one of the KPIs is certainly, energy footprint, energy intensity, what's your energy per person, what's your energy with Paris-proof goals, etc. But on the other side, you want to have a utilized asset with high income. That should be the primary goal, which comes around occupancy and usage. So that's another KPI that I think real estate should be measuring.
Do you find that those income models are changing, or do you find them still to be quite consistent with how it's always been?
I think it's definitely changing. So post-pandemic, there's a lot of people giving leases back. And then in the building space, you have increasing interest rates, you have increasing energy costs. So there's some financial and economic dynamics that have changed dramatically over the last couple of years, which I think will make these KPIs be much more prominent. And then the other part is you look at the user experience. So the days of coming in 9 to 5, Monday through Friday have changed. So now you have different work patterns. People are demanding flexibility. They've already shown that, companies even like Apple, the executives demanding that people come in every day, it doesn't work. So how do you deliver something that's flexible to meet all the needs? And the personas. We talked at lunch about personas. I think that's a very important aspect, because we're not all the same.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, so when we are thinking about, aligning stakeholders for this massive transformation that we're seeing in real estate, we see it, you have your investors, your owners, your developers, you have your tenants, the people who are running businesses within these buildings, you have your users. I mean, it's quite fragmented. There's a lot of stakeholders. How do you even start to align stakeholders in a really complex structure like that?
I would like to ask Jeroen a question there, because we build buildings for people, and I know you've done a lot of work on defining personas and building around. I think that's where it needs to begin. So you don't come from the real estate industry. So how would you advise us to look at it from the real estate perspective?
Well, I just, and granted, I'm not a real estate expert, so apologies for that in that sense. But when I think of real estate, and you've got people in the building, working in the building, living in the building, owning a shop or running a business or whatever, those are users in a sense, and you can build personas around that. Individual personas that outlines their interaction model, their journeys, right? Then you will also have your management of those buildings, right? Your tenants, and I would imagine there would be finance managers, there would be real estate managers, or whatever kind. And they also have a way of interacting in the building and for the building. And again, you can outline those. So the way that we develop then personas is to say, well, there is Bob. Bob owns a business. He has a furniture store on the first floor, and Bob comes to work every day. How does Bob interact in that building? And you can outline that. It's not a process model. Some people think that journey mapping and process modeling are the same thing. No. So this is really, how does Bob think? How does he feel? What does he do every day? There's even little things as going to the toilet. Right? And you can map that all out, that interaction model. And then what you do is you map the capabilities and the functionalities within a building that you would find in the building against Bob's interaction needs and even to his feelings sometimes. And that's just one person. Then you have your guard that walks around the building at night, right? Okay, so how does he walk around the building, right? And how does he interact in a sense with that building, not on a personal level, obviously, but still he has an interaction model as he goes about his business. So for all of those personas, you can map that out. But then it really becomes interesting because, well, the personas interact with each other as well. And you will never have one person only using one space. So how do those interaction models then come together? And again, if you look at it from a functionality point of view, how does that functionality then that assists Bob, but not, Peter the lifeguard, or not the lifeguard, but the guard that walks around, right? How does one functionality support both? And that's I would imagine from a stakeholder point of view, how you can align. But at the end of the day, whether it's Bob, whether it's Peter, whether it's Francis, whether it's any other person, at the end of the day, a building represents a particular value to them, right? And the question, therefore, is what is that value that the building represents, and how is that value that the building represents is reflected in that interaction model, in that journey?
But also important is that the building needs to facilitate for the users. It needs to, users shouldn't be need to have the urge to open a window because it's too warm, or the building shouldn't be noticing that they are in a building. They should be doing what they want to do in the building, but not,
But you can integrate that into a persona, right? So you can say, for example, let's go back to Bob, for lack of a better example right now. But Bob likes a temperature of 18.5 degrees. That's just what Bob likes. And then in that interaction that Bob has, you can integrate in that in everything that he does, he likes 18.5 degrees. Now, then you have Francis, and Francis, for some bizarre reasons, he's grown up, in Tahiti, he likes 21 degrees. Then again, you integrate that into her behavioral patterns.
but they cannot meet because otherwise it will be too hot or too cold.
And that's where the value comes into play as well, right? So who presents what value within the overall construct of the building? And so there's always a value conversation in that as well, right? Because you can't tailor to everyone in the same fashion. So that's where the KPI conversation comes into play.
So how do you deal with it when you have fragmented stakeholders with different needs on that same asset and that same technology and the same what they're dealing with?
I go back, like I said, without knowing reasons, but I go back to the KPI conversation, right? I mean, which KPIs do you find? So, for example, you've got efficiency KPIs. I would imagine within a building, which are not necessarily congruent with a KPI that is based on user experience, right? So the question then becomes, which of those KPIs do you give what kind of importance? And then based on those KPIs and the value that the KPIs represent, you can say, okay, well, based on those KPIs, along those journeys that I've mapped out for these different personas, I can give certain functionality more or less importance.
I think from a digital perspective, it's still really early days. You have companies like Leaseman that'll do user surveys and how good was the experience in the building. But I also go back to if you want to start at a basic level, measure the occupancy, because if people are enjoying it, like a restaurant or a club or a museum, they'll keep coming back. If they're not enjoying it, they won't come back. So that's probably a baseline, and then get to the next level. Okay, we know you came back, but how good was your experience or bad was your experience, and start to measure that digitally.
Were you happy?
Were you happy in that case? Exactly. And then, do you want to share that data with the building owner, facilities management? So people opening up and feeling like they can participate.
It's a good testing, by the way. It's how many companies, irrespective of industry, in this world of innovation, of change, and that are still afraid to talk to customers, right? Just afraid to. So how many times I meet with clients that say, oh, don't worry about customer research. We know it already. Talk to somebody in sales or in marketing, because they really understand the customer inside out. And quite often that leads paths that are not always the best way forward.
So, I mean, what you're talking about is actually a pretty in-depth research approach to coming up with these KPIs and these value drivers.
But it's like I said, you've got those three angles, right? You've got business viability, technological feasibility, and then human desirability, right? So I'm not saying that human desirability is the most important at all costs, right? No, I'm not. I'm just saying that if you want to do it in the most effective way, you need to find the right balance between all three of them. And all three of them will have different KPIs, right? So business viability, right? Sometimes I say, the customer is always king. No, they're not, right? So I go back to, right? So for each of those three levers, the question is, how do you find the right balance, right? And each of those levers will also have their own stakeholders that are proponents of those, right? And that's usually where the difficulties are coming from. How do you find the right balance between those three levers and the stakeholders that represent those levers?
Hey, Nicholas, I have a question for you, because you certify a lot of buildings and give them a score on how technologically advanced they are. And with Jeroen's comments on you need flexibility by the different personas and to meet those needs, and Peter mentioned different temperatures. How do you think the technology is able to deliver that now?
Well, it's definitely getting there, but I think it's important what you say. There's a step back, right? It's not only about the technical infrastructure; it's about what you're doing with that technology. So we're completely aligned with your approach of research-driven, data-driven, coming up with the clear KPIs and how to do it. So we have a module before you even get started on context. Like, what are you trying to do with this property?
Right.
Because that's fundamentally important before you start thinking about your value cases and you start thinking about your technical infrastructure. And then we have a module about governance. How are you setting yourself up to be successful, to take on that data and actually do something meaningful with it? And after that, then and you start going into the actual technical capabilities of what can this building do, what can it measure, what can it manage, how automated, how integrated, these types of things. And from a technical perspective, there's a lot that can be done. There's a ton that can be done. I think we're starting to really get to an exciting place where we can start to automate these things. But I think what you're talking about, there's a lot of innovation space still in how do we design these journeys for people and do it, for everybody what they need. So it's extremely exciting. But I think to answer your question, that it needs to be flexible, it needs to be context driven, it needs to be governance driven, it needs to be kind of based on these really, unique situations. Absolutely. Back to you, how is the technology delivering?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of data there. So there's enough data. So we now can start to understand how people are using the space, what kind of energy they're consuming, where they're consuming the energy. But where I think we need to go is from what I call smart buildings to intelligent buildings. So now we have all the big data, right? Okay, but how valuable is data if you don't get actionable insights? So that's where I think the industry needs to go is, okay, we combine all those things. Like, is the security guard walking around? Do they need it to be 24 degrees? Or do they need the right level of CO2? if they just walk through a room, 2 times a night? Probably not. So now we have that data, but now we need to convert that into action, and then even better into automation. So the machine does that as opposed to a human actually has to intervene.
Yeah.
But I still think in most cases we're far away from full automation, and a lot of people aren't ready to hand it over to the algorithm to run these buildings.
Yeah, and I love that about intelligent buildings, right? Because what we're also looking at in the certification is how can you, with the least amount of technology, do the maximum amount of stuff, right? Because Peter and we were speaking about if you have so much technology in your building, all of it needs to be managed, all of it needs to be maintained, all of it needs to be updated. So it becomes quite a lot to do. So how do we, with the least amount of technology, do the maximum amount of impact? And we have a module called Integrative Design, which is, exactly that. How can we integrate with other solutions and other providers? Don't do everything yourself, find good parties to work together that, fill your gaps.
But also keep it simple.
Yeah, key. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you make it too complex, people won't be engaged because it's too much. And keep it simple, but good. That's the main value of quality, of the most value added. Doing what you do good instead of doing a lot and not entirely good.
And I think that's a really nice point from a stakeholder perspective, right? Of how do we get stakeholders to align and work together and break down silos and break down walls so that we can actually get this stuff to go a little bit faster and bigger, and keeping it simple is fundamentally critical.
I have a question for Peter around the stakeholders in real estate, because you have the tenants, right? And ultimately you need the tenants because if you don't have tenants, then you don't need a building. And then you have facility managers, and then you have the building owners. And typically the conversation between the owners and the tenants is in some cases non-existent. So there's not that connectivity. So that would help. But what we see when employing this intelligent building technology is getting those stakeholders to align. So when you talk about energy, the tenant pays the energy bill. They have to do some reporting for their CO2 footprint. You have the facility manager that actually delivers the SLA on comfort in the building and employee experience. And then you have the owner who sometimes needs to invest in the technology to enable all these things. And they have different alignment there. And sometimes it's not aligned to the end user experience and the benefit of the planet and reduce energy costs. So how do you approach that?
What we do is, we create value at all levels, because the tenant wants a better indoor climate and less costs.
Okay.
The facility manager wants less complaints, and the owner wants a better building. Because we keep the indoor climate optimized, so the temperature doesn't fluctuate, and that increases the tenants' happiness, because it's not always too warm or too cold, or it fluctuates. But it also reduces energy costs. So for the tenants, they have less CO2 footprint, less energy costs. The facility manager has less complaints, because traditionally, if there is a complaint in the building, what do? Increase the temperature, increase the ventilation. Then that one complaint goes away. A lot of different other complaints get started. Energy consumption goes up, but the facility manager has one complaint solved. But then the result of that action, is not overseen. And the owner wants the tenants to be happy in the building and remain in the building. And I think we have a good balance on both, on all three sides.
And do you work with them all simultaneously, or do you work with, which one are you working with? Are you working with just the person who's paying the bill and saying we're implementing this?
We
should do that.
Working mainly for building owners, but we also are working with or companies that rent buildings. So for the owner, they want to have it, because you also have who does the investments and who has the lower energy bill. So in that case, the owner should invest, but the tenants have all the profits.
Yeah.
And but we can also have it as a service that a tenant can say, okay, I want this in the building, and I want to reduce my energy costs immediately. So
it's changing quickly now, and we're seeing a huge uptick in the adoption of technology in buildings, and it's very, very encouraging. But there has been this, why should I make that CapEx investment when I'm not going to benefit from it, or the benefit is not clear, or the value is not clear. It's happening on the operational costs, which I don't even pay. So why would I put in this technology? At the same time, we need them to take that decision because it's at a point when the walls are open and you can actually do that without that challenge. So, yeah, I mean, how are you guys doing it over at Edge Next? Are you guys able to break down that conversation?
Yeah, it's very similar where you have the building owner, and then now there's also government regulations, so they need to report on the energy consumption. Their asset has to fit into the EU taxonomy, so there's some government pressure saying, okay, our buildings need to be more sustainable. And then we're also starting to see some market pressure. So there are some companies that are saying post-pandemic, I want to give back some space. So actually, if maybe they don't benefit directly, but if they can lease a space with a lower running cost, for the tenant, it's actually a lower cost as well. So maybe the rent is not lower, but then if the operating costs are lower, it's more attractive to the tenants. Because now with people giving back space or subleasing space, there's going to be more competition to lease the space. So ultimately, it's good for the building owner because they have a steady income in terms of rental income. So
yeah, I was going to say,
Can I just ask a question?
absolutely, yeah.
So within the process of design, how much is driven by CoDesign? So multiple stakeholders coming together within a specific way of running design, with each having their own role within the design process, because you can talk about exchange of information and looking to see if there's a common value proposition, all very important. But if there's still one or two parties that is running the design, most of it, whereas the 3-4 other parties, stakeholders, have to kind of sit and wait until something's designed, then aren't you reverse engineering then? Maybe I'm off the mark.
It's interesting, right? Because I think that it doesn't happen all the time. It should happen all the time. But my co-founder, Elizabeth Nelson, she also does a keynote on this very topic. And what she says is that the buildings are designed for male extroverts, right? Because they're the ones in meeting rooms willing to speak about what should be designed and who should get what and all these things. And the female introvert, which she is actually, doesn't get their voice heard because they're not there. They're not in that discussion. And that's really interesting, right? Because then you're actually designing, when you do this, for a very subset of population. So I think it's a great advice or something to say is that we need to be inclusive in that design process.
But then you also need to have a recognizable design process to start with, right?
Yes.
If I'm sure overall, if you look at the overall guiding principles behind design and the process of design, they would probably be universal. But in the way it's being applied, that's quite often very different, at least in industries that I work in, right? So I would imagine that if there's a universally recognizable process of design before you start design and everyone knows their role within that design process, then be it, whether you're introvert or extrovert, it's of lesser importance because everybody maintains the key principles of the design process.
I mean, Edge, our parent company, there's a real estate developer, have developed some of the most sustainable and user-friendly real estate. They have an innovation team that's focused on ESG, energy, social good, but then also employee wellness. So we have people on staff entirely focused on employee wellness. But I have to say, from a data-driven approach, so they'll take those into account. But are they, how are companies really starting to use data and map it? I think one of the best examples is Spotify. So what they do is, they've been expanding and building new offices. They're a data-driven company. So they take that approach to architectural design as well. So they map out the data by persona. So are you on the marketing side or the finance side? And they start to understand how people are using the building in a data-driven approach. And then when they design a new office, they take that footprint and design it based on their other office space. Some variants for cultures, right? Because Asian cultures are different than European cultures, but they do have that data-driven approach to the design, which I think is the future.
Well, another, again, from other industries, but something that, impacts disruption between stakeholders is, and again, more raising a question, is the need for speed.
Yeah.
Right? Things can't be done quickly enough. And that's in that whole process of just of speed-driven innovation or speed-driven the design, alignment between stakeholders is kind of thrown out of the door just because of that need for speed. Is that also something that is in the real estate industry?
I think it's speed and flexibility. So you see the change of the usage patterns, previously people coming in every day and a weekday, now to more flex, and then also using the space beyond the normal working hours. So in our edge workspaces, they have conferences. So we have an auditorium, and then there's circular finance come in. People rent the space that aren't tenants in the building. So they're actually using that flexibility. And then I was in San Francisco around Christmas, and we went to a place on the ground floor was food. Then you had shopping. And then on the top floors were office space. And in the middle, there was a really large floor in downtown San Francisco, and it was a flex space. It said, within 5 minutes, it can be you can do a presentation, it can be a co-working space, or have an event like a party. So they were really advertising this flexibility, and they could change it in minutes. So that's also the speed and flexibility.
And I think there's a lot of parallel between the companies that are adopting technology and those that are not, in the sense that, we talked about it being a CAPEX investment, right? The developer, the owner who is going to put in that capital expenditure, there's really two types. There's one that plans on holding on to the building and knows exactly what they're going to do with that building. And then those journeys are quite easy to map, or easier to map. And the technology is easier to put in because you know exactly what you're going to do with that technology. The other one, which is a little bit more challenging and very common in the real estate space, are developers that plan on selling the property or leasing it. And they don't necessarily know who's going to take it over. They don't know who's going to be there. So how can we design journeys for something we don't yet know how it's going to be? So I think that comes down to your flexibility.
But ultimately, it goes back to what Jeroen mentioned, is what's the disruption in the business model and KPI. So in this flexibility, it's a flex space, but then you can use it and rent it. So the incremental rent is higher per square meter than a 10-year lease. So there is a business model disruption that's profitable in there as well. And if you didn't have that, then why would you have the flexibility and the speed, right? Yeah. So there's got to be a business model there.
Yeah, and we see that in some of the buildings that we're certifying for that case, right? Is they're putting so much technology into these buildings just so that they can be flexible for whatever may happen. But, to our discussion earlier, when is too much, and how can we actually put our finger on the right amount? I think that's a really interesting piece.
You shouldn't have big data and bigger data, but you need to have the smart data. I know which data you want to have that can influence the building, and which variables you want to influence, and not have data. Because if you want to have it, take your example again, with 18.5 degrees and 21 degrees, if they're sitting next to each other, that doesn't match. But some people, sometimes in buildings, they have an app. Okay, I want to have 18.5 degrees, and sitting in an open space. That's very difficult. And then that's, again, you want to have it that the people shouldn't shouldn't complain about the building. And if you want to have it a bit warmer, you can also put on a sweater. But if it's too warm, too cold, you have to put on or take out your sweater every time. That gets annoying.
Yeah. But it's also really interesting, right? Because when we see these buildings that are putting in as much technology as they can, they don't know exactly why, but they have a good idea. There's also new value cases being generated from that. But I think you said something about innovation and and too much of it is actually, or too fast is disruptive.
Well, there's innovation as part of our first mover action, right? I want to be the first in the market, and your innovation is therefore also highly experimental in what you do, right? And in that case, it's really speed can be of huge importance, right? Because innovation is all around us, and from larger firms to the smaller, even startups, everyone's driving some sort of innovation agenda. So speed, in that sense, can definitely have great value, right? But it can also slap you in the face, because sometimes speed overrides sense. Right, and that's what I see sometimes, that speed overrides sense, right? So if I'm in the car and I'm speeding towards a brick wall, the brick wall is still a brick wall, I'm going to hit it, right? So speed isn't always the only KPI that is determinant of success. So again, I go back to what I said, it's also business viability. You need to understand, what am I innovating for? If you're talking about any kind of technology, be it, initially from a smart meter point of view, or be it lights that suddenly pop up, there has to have, you need to be clear up front, who am I doing that for? And then once you have that clarity of mind, who am I doing it for, and what is the business impact that I look to generate, then speed can have huge positive impacts for you. But just speed for the sake of speed, I don't believe it.
Yeah, but there's also, if you take another example, not a brick wall, but take the wrong exit, and you have speed, but you need to know where you need to go to.
Yeah,
you need to have a goal to work towards. And if you go too fast and you take the wrong exit, then you will not reach your goal.
But here's a thing also with speed, because we were talking about the stakeholder alignment, right? I mean, many times when I meet with clients and they have any kind of misalignment between stakeholders, speed is quite often a very important reason for that. It's because the company is going so fast, particularly departments were even going so fast, that the rest of the organization just can't keep up, right? Not because they don't want to keep up, but just because decision making is done so quickly and people are not, there's no buy-in within the direction that the company is going, or even buying within a particular product innovation that is being put out into the market. So speed, again, speed can be of great impact, but you need to organize yourself for speed as well, right? So stakeholder alignment, if you want to run and run fast, then you may as well make sure that before you start to run, all your stakeholders know that you're running and that they're all singing the same hymn sheet. And if you don't have that, then speed can actually get you to a great deal of trouble, because you don't have all your stakeholders lined up.
And what about innovation from a shotgun perspective versus an arrow perspective? Trying 1,000 things or doing 1,000 things to hopefully land on something, I don't know, and then, a more focused approach.
Yeah, you also see that in marketing, right? There used to be the days of just putting billboards up and just hoping that people will see it. And in innovation, you can see the same thing. I don't think that necessarily a scattergun approach is the most efficient way of running it. If you're a larger organization and you've got deep pockets, then a scatter approach, may well work, because you can just, you can still muscle it out, within the rest of the organization if you fail. But if you're a smaller company and you go for the scatter approach and then you fail, then immediately your lifeline is at risk as an organization. Is that what you want? Not necessarily. So, but there are many different colors between the scattered approach and the pinpoints approach, because at the end of the day, if you want to do so much research to be ultra focused, then somebody may have caught up with you already, right? That is on the same path. So there's no one answer to that, Nick. It really depends on what you're able to stomach as an organization yourself as well, and how well do you know your audience, right? How well do you know your customer? I think that's the most important part. You can go scattered, but if you can still go scattered within an environment that you know inside out, that even if you go scattered, you may still be, on the mark. But if you go scattered in an environment that is just filled with question marks, then you may set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, I agree. And, from a marketing perspective, same thing. You don't need to scatter. And now we have the data like Google or someone else. You can define these personas. You can do the same in real estate. You have employee booking apps. You have data sensor tracking. You can even start to understand a user's preference and say, okay, go to an area where it's warm or an area where it's quiet. So I think we should move beyond relatively quickly to start to understand these personas and how they're using buildings, maybe who they are. Maybe you don't need to know their name like Bob, but we know, okay, there's different types of people using the building in different ways. And that data is there with the booking apps, with the occupancy sensors.
For some buildings.
For some buildings, for the smart and intelligent buildings. So I think from a real estate perspective, we need to make that next step with speed and start to really define these personas and understand them. And then
Understand that data and the value of what it can actually bring for these different value.
But also organize yourself for speed. It's one of
the speed, yeah, and align everyone to that and say, okay, well, our target is to reduce energy costs. Our target is to increase occupancy rates. So have some simple targets and start to understand the data and what data you need so you have the right amount of smart.
Yeah, and I think the buildings that don't have that data structure or that infrastructure, it's a strong move to put that in, because then you actually have the data to do these experiments with, to do this guidance and this transformation.
Yeah, but it's also you need a. You don't have to have the final answer immediately. We can have it. We can first start with the stuff that is already in the building, then take a next phase, add some sensors, add some technology. That's also a road that you are walking towards, and you don't have to implement everything at once, because then it's too much. So again, that's also use the building that you have as good as possible, but then also increase it bit by bit.
A lot of the stakeholders in the Smart Building Collective, we ask them these questions, and it's pretty unanimous that, start small and grow as you're adding value to the space and the building. And you see some buildings and developers that say, show me the money and I'll do it. And you see others that are more altruistic about it. They know it's the right thing. They don't know exactly why yet, but they're willing to experiment. And I think the truth is in the middle there somewhere.
What we do for a lot of big institutional investors with large real estate portfolios, we have proven our technology in a few buildings, and now they're saying, okay, what you do, you are able to optimize the building as is with a small. You don't have to remodel it or do stuff. You only bring smartness into the building as is. We see a good result from that. Please do it in our global portfolio.
Started small, and then you grow.
And then also be able to adapt with adding technology.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, I want to ask a question that might be controversial, but a lot of building owners, they're going for certificates. So BREEAM, other WELL certifications. Part of the getting those certifications is the SMART. What are your thoughts on that, Nick? Is it the right approach and the right level of technology?
I find it, it's a really interesting and important question, and I find it also kind of a disturbing question from what we see in the market. Because yes, it's important to be able to tell the world that your building is amazing, but what we've always said is that technology, it's not only about the technology, it's what you do with it, right? We have a number of big companies, really wonderful companies that say, you know what? We don't want to put the stamp on the wall because it's dependent on the people and the operation on a daily basis for how we're going to get value out of this smart. And I really love that philosophy, and we work with them on in that way. So yeah, for us, when we set out with the smart building certification, we never wanted it to be the stamp, like the stamp was the goal.
Right.
We want it to be the beginning, because the moment we know what's going on in a building, you can go on a journey of transformation, of innovation, of research, of thought leadership, and really dive into all those details, and then use the collective ecosystem to help you do that. So it is interesting to tell the world that you're busy with something exciting. I think that it's useful in that way, but that can't be it. It has to be deeper than that. And that's why we set out to do it in the way we've done it, because we couldn't find that in the market. So we really think the power of the collective is important, learning from each other, transforming together, innovating together, but then doing that continuously and not just at a moment.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So you get a stamp, so then you know what you're getting as a building owner, as a buyer, but then the magic happens in the run. So how are you using that data? How are you using the systems? How are you automating it to make it actually live up to the promise of the certifications?
Exactly, and the certification, it goes in depth, right? So it's not only about that stamp; it's about, for the first time, consolidating your smart strategy in a place that you can give it to different people. We're seeing organizations use it for their change management to say, "Hey, new owner, this is what your building is capable of," right? And that's actually a little bit more interesting than the stamp itself, saying this. You can do a lot, and these are the value cases, and this is what we've been working on. This is the research, and we actually see that eventually that smart infrastructure, it is an asset. It's an asset of its own. It's not just part of the building.
Yeah.
It can be an asset unique. So maybe at a certain point we're putting that into the blockchain and we're selling that with the building, and we're transferring ownership of all of that technology and that data and the documentation and everything in one go, and then all of a sudden it's way more than a certificate. It's a transformational process that you're on, and continuous.
I mean, that's one of the benefits of data and having it in a centralized place and having these buildings be smart, is then all the stakeholders have the single source of truth, because that's another problem we see with different systems. The tenant sees one thing, the user sees another thing, or experiences another thing. The owner has something different. So having these smart buildings with consolidated data sets, then all the stakeholders are reading from the same hymn sheet, or the same set of data.
And benchmarking. So, I mean, we're not only benchmarking the technology, like I said, we're benchmarking the governance and the context. And what's really interesting is we've seen buildings that have had a really kind of a challenging time to consolidate their smart building infrastructure in one kind of smart building assessment for us, because it's spread across all kinds of suppliers and departments and stakeholders. It's kind of all over the place. So the benefit for them is that once they're done, it is centralized. They have it all in one place and can use it that way. But we also see other organizations that have completely consolidated themselves on the smart building team. So it's a smart building team, 4 or 5 people, very specialized in the technology and the data and how it works. And then they liaise with the different departments to get value out of that smart building. And it's a completely different, structure. And we've seen everything in between. But I think that that's really, really fascinating as a part of this smart building discussion, is how do you organize yourself and your stakeholders to get the maximum out of these technologies?
So are you recommending that people have dedicated smart building teams in the organization to get the most value, in addition to the technology?
We've seen that being the best result till now. We try and stay out of what's right or what's wrong, right? Because I think we're all learning. It's still early days from a smart building perspective. But when we benchmark things against each other, that one seems to have the most clarity as to why they have a smart building and how they're going to use that smart building. And I think when it's spread out, nobody really has the clue as to exactly why they're doing it. And that's a really interesting.
So I'm hearing with stakeholder alignment, don't just get the technology, but get a dedicated team, and that's where you'll get the most success.
Definitely.
Nice.
Now organize yourself to get the maximum impact out of your.
Super. I think we're wrapping up. We don't want to bore our users. We could probably talk for hours on this stuff. Any closing statements, message for the team, for the market?
You catch me a bit off guard. No, I think again, what I see, and I'm talking across industries. What I see at the moment, a lot of companies are struggling with is a lack of organization that allows them for the speed and innovation. So no lack of ambition, no lack of vision, not even a lack of resources in that sense. But if you don't organize yourself, just like to your point, if you don't organize yourself effectively, and you're so driven by speed, then quite often you will fail in that process. And even if you don't feel, you may heavily overinvest.
Great.
And I think that's what everyone's trying to avoid.
Definitely. Yeah.
Peter. Yeah, well, I would, we are on the beginning of the journey, and also important in the journey is that transparency, that everyone has the same data sheet and looking at it and being transparent about it. And it's we have a difficult road ahead, but it's a good road. It's really, we'll be learning on our way, but it's we don't need to go too fast, but we need to go forward. And there are a lot of buildings in Holland, the existing buildings, and now that also need some transformation, and they need to be made smarter than they are right now. And for new developments, it's more easy to incorporate the smart technology, but it's also very important to upgrade in an easy way the existing buildings to increase their smartness, but also to achieve our sustainability goals.
So amazing. And I want to thank you guys for coming. I think it's so important for us to look outside industry as well, to get a different perspective to be brought in and look at it from different angles, and also from the technology and the innovation perspective. This was a great conversation. I don't think the users were bored, but I think it's
Well, that was the goal.
it was fantastic, and I took a lot from it. And
thanks for joining. Fantastic conversation, and thanks for joining us at EdgeNext Studios. Stay tuned for the next session.